This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast though, as always, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind the scenes stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, well, they have a mainstream leaning to them really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do punching down stuff. I try not to do snarky stuff really. I just see it's an achievement and a half to make a film, and that's kind of what I want to celebrate. Each episode, each regular episode, of which this is one, I cover two films, and I may as well just crack on with the first of them. Let's go all the way back to 2002. I'm going to play you a clip. I'll get to the story the other side of this.
Who are you?
You're the priest's son, aren't you? His name's Amsterdam.
Amsterdam? I'm New York.
Everything you see belongs to me. The newsboys and quick thieves and blind tigers here in paradise. Everybody owes, everybody pays.
What do you think you're doing?
I'm dancing.
So why aren't you dancing with him?
I'm not in love with him.
There's more of us coming off these ships every day. 15,000 Irish a week. Get all of us together and we ain't got a gang. We got an army.
Challenge.
Challenge accepted.
I told the father.
Well, that sounds really exciting, doesn't it? That's a clip from 2002's Gangs of New York, directed by Martin Scorsese. Story credit goes to Jay Cox, who shares screenplay credit with Stephen Zalian and Kenneth Lonergan. Cast for this one includes Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis, Cameron Diaz, Jim Broadbent, John C. Reilly, Liam Neeson, Brendan Gleeson, Eddie Marsan in there, and a very fetching pair of glasses as well. Right to the end of the 1990s, though, there was kind of a narrative going round that suggested, not unreasonably, that director Martin Scorsese was long overdue an Oscar. Primarily, I think, because he was long overdue an Oscar. He'd made films such as Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas. Each of those could comfortably have walked away with a Best Picture Oscar or a Best Director Oscar as well. I don't think anyone in the slightest would have grumbled. For me, I'd add King of Comedy to that list as well. But nonetheless, the point here was that Scorsese films kept going up for the Oscars and kept being beaten by films such as Ordinary People and Dances with Wolves. And I'm a huge fan of Dances with Wolves, but even I would suggest it probably did well to eclipse Goodfellas all the way back at the start of the 90s. So there was a feeling that Scorsese was due. Now, separately, Miramax was a company that was regarded as the best in the business at campaigning for Oscars, and this was in the era where it was still being headed up by convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein. And so it seemed natural with the push for Scorsese towards an Academy Award and towards Academy Award fare that at some point Harvey Weinstein, Miramax and Scorsese would end up working together. Now, since 1977, the further ingredient at the heart of this story was the fact that Martin Scorsese had been wanting to tell the story of rival immigrant groups and their battles in the formation of New York City. And this was always, from day one, a hugely ambitious project to begin to tackle. It had lots of ingredients for a start, a revenge story, a romance. It had huge battle scenes in there. And Scorsese had been toying with this ever since he'd read Herbert Asbury's book, The Gangs of New York, An Informal History of the Underground, and that dated back decades, but Scorsese had read it at the start of the 70s. Now, by 1977, off the back of Taxi Driver, which had been released to sizable acclaim, and now heading towards his mid-30s, Scorsese decided to take a gamble. He thus bought a 2-page advertisement in the Hollywood trade Bible Variety, proclaiming that his next project would be a film called Gangs of New York. This was in 1977. Couple of problems then. First and foremost, he didn't actually have the script at that point. Also problematic, he didn't have a financial backer for the project. Now, Jay Cox in the end would come aboard to write a 179-page draft, so that also threw more fun into the mix, in that this was going to be a film that pushed 3 hours in the state that Scorsese wanted to make it, and whilst he had a degree of currency at this point in his career, he didn't have that much. Now, it was also unfortunate, or fortunate, depending how you see the final film, that in the 1970s, something else happened that stopped Scorsese being able to make the project then. Because in the early 70s, we saw the rise of an emerging group of filmmakers. Peter Biskin charts this in his excellent book, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. And the mid-70s have brought directors such as Francis Ford Coppola, Michael Cimino, Brian De Palma. They were starting to come through and have success in a very un-Hollywood way. Hollywood saw the success and got the checkbooks out. These are the people making money. I mean, George Lucas came along and did Star Wars. Spielberg came along and did Jaws. It's like, give them money. Let's make more money. They gave money to Francis Ford Coppola for Apocalypse Now, though, and Michael Cimino for Heaven's Gate. And those were two projects that spiralled out of control, really, and ended up critically very different. Let's charitably suggest that. They didn't return the investment to the financiers, at least not initially. And it also played to the story, really, that these were maverick directors. They couldn't be controlled by the studio. And when the success dried up, it's just like, well, let's go and work with the more conventional directors again, because that's far less risky. And Scorsese bore a brunt to that, as he lamented to Entertainment Weekly. That era was the end of the power of the director. And I mean, you look at the gravitas with which Apocalypse Now is viewed now, it took time to find that reputation, and but by then the chance of anyone ever being able to make a film of Apocalypse Now with copious amounts of other people's money, well, let's just say that window had narrowed enormously. So it also led to the end, at least for the time being, of Gangs of New York, at least for the best part of 3 decades. There were sizable costs to the film that Scorsese wanted to realise. I mean, for a start, you would have to build a very different New York City, because part and parcel of the approach to the film was that Scorsese didn't want it to be recognisable. The whole idea of Gangs of New York is it's a story about the formation of New York, and how it builds up ultimately is talked about towards the end of the movie. I say this non-spoilery, but crucially for the visual look of it, it had to be done very, very, very differently. That was going to cost an enormous amount of money. Nonetheless, Scorsese hit another useful patch in the 1990s, the start of the 90s. Goodfellas came out in 1990, and it did well. Also attracted huge amounts of acclaim. Cape Fear then came out. I've covered that on a previous episode. That would come out and be a box office hit as well. Scorsese movie that was a closest he'd get to a blockbuster hit. And so he had currency at this point, and so Warner Brothers took a look at the Gang of New York's project, and this is charted a little bit in Tom Schon's book about Scorsese, which I do recommend, but he decided to turn it down. Then Scorsese moved over to work with Disney for a bit, notably with the infamous film Kundun. Now, Kundun was a film that caused an awful lot of political problem for Disney, and affected conversations about the release of their movies in certain parts of the world. When the film then just was released and pretty much disappeared without trace, Disney backed off Gangs of New York as well. It had been toying with working with Scorsese, Scorsese again. Scorsese then went back to Universal and did Casino, but that didn't do as well as it had been expected as well. And so by the end of the decade, he was having a battle to bring together a film called Bringing Out the Dead, which he ultimately got made, and it's generally regarded as one of the underrated and underseen Scorseses. Nicolas Cage in particular is excellent in it. But it was on the set of Bringing Out the Dead that his agent visited him and dropped in the name of Leonardo DiCaprio. Do you want to work with Leonardo DiCaprio? Now, DiCaprio, by the end of the 1990s, off the back of Titanic, and also let's not overlook the fact that The Man in the Iron Mask was a hit as well, but he was the must cast young breakthrough movie star, and studios were queuing up to work with him. I mean, Baz Luhrmann's take on Romeo and Juliet starring DiCaprio, that had been a success. Titanic, though, was a juggernaut, and a lot of the repeat business that Titanic attracted was put down to DiCaprio's presence in there, the coupling of DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. So by this stage, De Niro had also mentioned Leonardo DiCaprio's name to Scorsese because he'd worked with him on the film This Boy's Life, directed by Michael Caton Jones, and so Scorsese was intrigued. And what then happened was a further meeting with his reps at Artist Management Group, which brought the question, really, if you could make any film at all that you'd want to make, what would it be? And so Scorsese instantly said, Gangs of New York. Now, his agents thus took the idea to Harvey Weinstein at Miramax. Weinstein was very keen to work with Scorsese. I mean, that looked like Oscar gold to him, and what a story for Weinstein in his Oscar campaigning if he was the person to get Scorsese the Oscar. And a deal was starting to come together between these unlikely collaborators, and spoiler, it would not be a very healthy or happy collaboration, but finally Gangs of New York was going to get off the ground, that Miramax was going to put forward the lion's share of the budget, which in the region of £80 million it was reportedly going to cost, which for a film that was still brushing towards 3 hours in the version that was written, and didn't massively have a huge amount of obvious commercial appeal. Well, it was a risk. It was a risk significantly mitigated by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he was really believed to be the reason that this film got over the line, that by casting DiCaprio in there was the must-have movie star of the moment, and thus that would offset the many other risks of this particular project. Now, it came to the casting of the movie, and Scorsese had worked oftentimes, of course, with Robert De Niro. He's more recently reunited with him on The Irishman, but he hadn't worked with him since Casino at this point, which then was only a few years prior. But a conversation was had between Scorsese and De Niro. Would De Niro like to take on the role of Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York? No, De Niro would not. A bit of a surprise. So Scorsese went back to someone else he'd worked with before. He'd worked with Daniel Day-Lewis on the film The Age of Innocence, which came out in the early 90s, which again wasn't a huge hit and didn't trouble the award ceremonies as much as people had expected it to. Daniel Day-Lewis, though, well, he'd stepped away from acting, really, not for the first time by the end of the 1990s. He'd taken on a role in The Boxer in 1997. He'd been the lead of that. But after that, well, he just hadn't acted, and the tabloid chatter at the time was that he'd gone off to make shoes in Italy, and there was some truth to that. He did reportedly work as an apprentice for an Italian shoemaker, but actually he'd also spent time away from acting to be with his family. He's married to Rebecca Miller, who's trying to get films off the ground, and he basically instructed his agents, don't send me any scripts. So even though Scorsese was interested in Daniel Day-Lewis, he couldn't actually get hold of him. Well, that was until Rebecca Miller was trying to get a film she was looking to direct off the ground called Personal Velocity, a film she would ultimately get made without the help of the Weinsteins, and that would go on to earn a degree of acclaim. But Day-Lewis put in a call to Weinstein to see if he would be interested in investing in Rebecca Miller's movie. And they had a conversation about it, but and it's fair to say that most stories suggest Daniel Day-Lewis was not a fan of Harvey Weinstein, but nonetheless they had the conversation. Weinstein at that point replied that Martin Scorsese was looking for him. Now, Miramax didn't put the money into Miller's film, but Daniel Day-Lewis would call Martin Scorsese up and they would meet in Scorsese's office, where Scorsese just showed Day-Lewis what he wanted to do, the level of detail he put in, the plans that he had for the film, the drawings, the designs. And whilst it wasn't an instant straight away yes, Daniel Day-Lewis agreed to sign up. He was going to be Bill the Butcher in the movie, with DiCaprio on board as well, and he'd been the first to sign on. There was then the role of the female lead in the film. Now, this is the character of Jenny Everdeen, and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people auditioned for this one. Cameron Diaz, meanwhile, at this point, well, she'd had a huge hit of her own. There's Something About Mary, which Scorsese had actually caught a bit of, and she was shooting Charlie's Angels at this point, the first Charlie's Angels movie for director McGee, and she flew into New York to audition for Gangs of New York. Now, she had some independent movie cachet at this point, that she'd done Being John Malkovich. Well, she was involved in Being John Malkovich at this point. She'd also been in a film called The Last Supper, which I really recommend seeking out. I think it's a really smart indie movie. But it was known that she was open for more interesting films and not just straight down the line commercial stuff, so that she was mixing things up a bit. And I have no problem with straight down the line commercial stuff. There's absolutely no snobbery there. So Scorsese auditioned her, and lots and lots of high-profile Hollywood actors auditioned for the role of Jenny. But what changed this one? Well, Cameron Diaz knew Leonardo DiCaprio. They were friends, and he was there, and the pair of them read together. And Scorsese saw not just that Diaz was putting in a performance here, but also she was lifting DiCaprio's performance. And it was that, combined with her work in Oliver Stone's Any Given Sunday, that really just clicked in Scorsese's head. He saw something there and he cast her in the movie. And obviously this was joyful news to Miramax, because now it didn't just have Leonardo DiCaprio, it had Cameron Diaz. And whilst Daniel Day-Lewis might not be box office gold, the other two were. There was still work to be done on the screenplay, though, and it was at Weinstein's suggestion that writer Steven Zalian was hired to come in and work on the script. This was, though, all against the backdrop of a potential writer's strike that was set to take place, in theory, in 2000. And as a result, Weinstein needed to get the writing done and get the project off the ground before this strike, which didn't actually materialise, would happen. So the fact that it didn't happen was by the by. It was the fear that it would that led to the accelerator being pushed sharpish on Gangs of New York. Far too sharp for Scorsese's liking. As it happened, it put him straight away against the clock, and Weinstein identified a start date of September the 18th, 2000, but what this left Scorsese with was barely a month to do pre-production and rehearsals, and it was at least 2 weeks less than the minimum amount of time he wanted. And so straight away, the film was off to a blistering start, that it was going too fast, and it didn't really, Scorsese hadn't had the usual full amount of time to prepare, notwithstanding the fact that he had this film in his head at this point for around 25 years. The shoot was not a happy one. Now, for a start, the script was still in flux, and other writers would come in. Hossein Amini came in and did work on it, but it'd be Kenneth Lonergan, directed the excellent You Can Count on Me. He was added to the roster of writers, and it was Lonergan who ended up going backwards and forwards to the set to keep working on the script, keep working on polishes for the script, which wasn't locked down at the point that production started. Now, on the bright side, the actual shoot was primarily taking place at the legendary Cinecittà Studios in Rome, and this had been the site of classic movies such as Ben-Hur and Cleopatra. So again, I mean, really of appeal to Scorsese. And the reason they needed such an extensive studio space, as Cinecittà provided, was the core set of the Five Points neighbourhood that's portrayed in Gangs of New York. That the set itself was nearly a mile long, with all sorts of tunnels and underground bits and loads of intricacies to it. I mean, the starting budget for the film was $83 million in the end, and a good chunk of that was building this incredible set. But it was an incredible set also that at times had hundreds of extras, and also it was a period movie, so hundreds of extras in period dress, and a director who could only really, for the huge scenes in the film, navigate the set on a golf cart, because just to be able to zip around and set everything up. This was a gigantic production, and if you look at the sequences both at the start and at the end of the movie, you really get a sense of that. There's not bags of CG trickery here. They put lots of human beings in front of the lens of a camera, and I think you can tell. Now, unsurprisingly, Daniel Day-Lewis was really into this. It's no secret at all that Day-Lewis is very method in the way that he approaches the vast bulk of his roles. So, as per usual, he utterly got into the character of Bill the Butcher. Now, on the bright side, he didn't go around hacking people to death, but he did arrive on set with his accent in place and his usual request that everybody called him by his character's name while shooting was ongoing. As Cameron Diaz would note after filming wrapped, I just met Daniel recently, because up until that point she'd just been referring to him as Bill. Now, separately, Harvey Weinstein was regularly checking on where his money was being spent, and he would fly to the set on at least 6 different occasions, as a report in Entertainment Weekly magazine testified, and his relationship with Scorsese was fracturing quickly. Now, it's worth noting, this was a huge investment for Miramax, but Weinstein very much had his eye on how can you sell the film. So, for instance, he hoped for a look from Daniel Day-Lewis that he could use on the poster. And when he discovered just what look the characters played by Day-Lewis and DiCaprio were having in the movie itself, well, let's just say he disagreed. And Miramax would send out what's described as ceaseless memos detailing the many concerns of Harvey Weinstein. As Scorsese would say, it was constant. There was one that said, "There's too much oil in the hair," said Daniel Day-Lewis. So I said, "Great, let me put some more oil in." And Scorsese would tell Tom Sean that when I bumped into Harvey on the stairs at Cinecittà, I said, "Harvey, I got the message about you wanting more oil in the hair. Is it okay now?" And there were little bits of, let's just say, working between the lines of communication. It was not a massively friendly interaction, to the point where the story goes that at one point Scorsese fixed mirrors to video monitors so he could see Weinstein coming. Scorsese, in fact, would threaten to walk off the picture a few times. It got that bad. And in the aftermath of Gangs of New York's production, he would describe the shoot as, quote, nightmarish. A further row while the shoot was starting to overrun started brewing over Cameron Diaz, because she joined the film on a low rate. She wasn't getting movie star salary for this film, but she was certainly getting it for her next. She had a commitment to do a film with Sony called The Sweetest Thing straight afterwards, and I think the sum she got for that was 8 figures. That wasn't the sum she got for Gangs of New York. She had a 4.5-month window to make Gangs of New York. In the end, she would be on set for 6 months, which caused a further massive row between Scorsese and Weinstein. Now, it's worth noting that DiCaprio and Scorsese by the end would put in around $6-7 million of their own money, as the budget for Gangs of New York went past the $100 million mark. It also, the shooting schedule went well over. The film overran, but it overran to the point where Sony, Columbia Pictures, which is owned by Sony, demanded Cameron Diaz's release for its own shoot. And there was the shoot was in such a degree of flux for Gangs of New York that at one stage it was said she'd been on set for weeks without actually shooting a scene. The scripts kept changing, things kept changing around her. And Jay Cox talked about how he was there to witness the last week of shooting in the end on Gangs of New York, and how Weinstein was pressuring Scorsese to shut it all down and just get it done. And Cox said that the pressure on Marty was extraordinarily intense. He was shooting the final confrontation between Daniel and Leo, and they actually made him stop before he got all the shots. They said, that's it. It's like you're running the vacuum cleaner and they pull the plug out. Props were being taken away. Extras were leaving. And basically, that Scorsese was having to complete the film against a backdrop of some of the tools he needed to finish getting all the shots he needed being removed. In the end, filming completed well over schedule at the end of March 2001, and it had been, let's just say, an intense 6 months. But it would still be a long time yet before we actually saw the final movie, because the post-production itself wasn't easy either. Now, Scorsese originally delivered a cut in 2001, But also in 2001, of course, there's the tragedy of the September 11th terrorist attacks, which left, in the aftermath of that, a lot of movies considering just what to do. And here was a New York-based film, and a very violent-based New York film. And there was a feeling that it wasn't the right time to release Gangs of New York in the aftermath of that. That the film had, that the plan was that the film would be in cinemas in 2001. But also, reshoots and editing were ongoing. So there were other problems as well that meant likely it just wouldn't have hit that its planned release date, even if other circumstances hadn't been in place. The final scenes were said to be shot in September 2002, with Scorsese and Weinstein in disagreement over the film. Weinstein needed this to be a commercial hit. Scorsese had a 3-hour cut of the film that he was just about happy with, but Miramax had a contract that was holding Scorsese to 2 hours 40 maximum. In the end, the film ended up at 168 minutes, and so if you knock the credits off, you just about get within the contract that Miramax held Scorsese to. But even when it came to the release, there was a problem, because it was in post-production for so long that DiCaprio had gone off and shot another movie with Steven Spielberg. I've covered it on a previous episode, Catch Me If You Can. This had been a far faster shoot, to the point where Catch Me If You Can was going to be ready for December 2002. Originally, this wouldn't have been a problem. Gangs of New York was supposed to be released in December 2001. But the production hadn't actually fully wrapped at that point, as it turned out. And so now, Gangs of New York and Catch Me If You Can, two competing Leonardo DiCaprio projects, were about to land at exactly the same Christmas, just at one point, exactly the same day. Weinstein had started trying to wind up the hype for Gangs of New York. He took it to the Cannes Film Festival in incomplete form in 2002, in the spring of 2002. And I think it was about 20 minutes of footage was screened, and Scorsese and key members of the cast went along. And there was positive reaction to that, but Weinstein wanted a December the 25th 2002 release date. It would have been commercial gold. It also would have put it slap bang in the middle of the Oscar race, because this was going to be the film to get Scorsese his Oscar, and everything sort of was coming together. But DreamWorks, which was distributing Catch Me If You Can, wasn't going to budge. It kind of sensed it had the more commercial movie here. It had the easier one to sell. And in the end, it was Weinstein that blinked first. That Gangs of New York came out on a staggered release, really. It would start on a few screens and build up, and it would get its wide release, days before Catch Me If You Can came out, but not on that lucrative Christmas Day release window that he originally wanted. Still, out it came, December the 21st, on 1,500 screens in the US. The reviews as well, appreciating now in hindsight, it tends to be regarded, I think, as one of the lesser Scorseses, but the reviews were hugely positive for this one. There was some mix to them, but lots of people put it on their best films of the year list, and it really did look like this was going to be Oscar time. That as well as the movie opening it was opening weekend, and again, it's worth noting, on a smaller number of screens. It opened at number 4 in the US with a 9.1 million opening weekend. Lord of the Rings The Two Towers was out the same week. It was up against the commercial might of 2 weeks' notice as well. That's not a bad film either. I'm not being snarky there. The week after, Gangs of New York would its screen count would go up, but Catch Me If You Can would also arrive and would open to $30 million, whilst Gangs of New York in its second weekend did 11. And I mean, if we just go through the box office number of it, ultimately it would gross 77 million in the US, 115 million overseas, for a worldwide gross of $193 million. The final negative cost was said to be in the region of about 100 million, 103 million, something like that. But it looked like the Oscars were coming when the nominations were announced, and there you had it, 10 Oscar nominations, including Best Director Martin Scorsese. About time, everyone thumped. And it looked like that was it, until a competing Miramax picture picked up momentum, and in the end it would be Chicago that took home Best Picture that year. Scorsese would be defeated by Roman Polanski for the Best Director gong, and Gangs of New York, well, it would come home empty-handed in the end. One thing, though, is that it would mark a period for Scorsese where the films that he was doing were just landing a little bit better than they had been towards parts of the 1990s. That he would follow this one up with The Aviator, reteaming with Leonardo DiCaprio. That he'd found a new collaborator there, and obviously they would go on and do lots of films together. And The Aviator, well, that nearly landed him as Oscar as well. Finally, just a few years after that, he did The Departed. That was the one that did it, but that is a story for another time. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories, which I'm delighted to say is being sponsored for the very first time. I'd like to extend huge thanks to Mutiny Shaving. You can find them at mutinyshaving.co.uk. They're on Twitter at Mutiny Shaving. They've got hashtag. I should get one of those. Hashtag Join the Mutiny. They are an eco-friendly shaving company, and they reached out to me. They said they like the podcast, bless them, and they are financially supporting this, which is allowing me to buy lots more research materials to do even more podcasts. So huge thanks to Mutiny Shaving. Do support them if you can. Likewise, if you are interested in more Film Stories bits and bobs, then first of all, I'm still an independent podcast producer. I still sit in a room by myself in the West Midlands, and nothing against the West Midlands, but I don't have a big company behind me. Thus, I am reliant on your word of mouth, really. If you like this podcast, please do subscribe to it. Therefore, please, if you can, leave ideally a hugely positive review. And at the point this has been recorded, I'm just about to sign off the latest issue of Film Stories magazine. You can find all about those magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going to go back to the 80s. How about I play you a clip?
See, the Northern Territory is wilderness. Now, if any of you city folk went out there, got lost, it would last about 3 days.
Oh, gosh. And you mean you were out there alone and wounded for 12 days, Mr. Riley?
Gator? No, I wasn't really alone, you see. I had old Bessie.
And how is old Bessie?
Gator? Nick! You're back!
Yeah.
You're back!
Yes, Bob.
I missed you.
I know.
I missed you. So...
And that is a clip from 1988's Crocodile Dundee II, directed by John Cornell, written by Paul Hogan and Brett Hogan, based on characters created 2 years previous for the original Crocodile Dundee by Paul Hogan. Hogan stars as Mick Crocodile Dundee, Linda Kozlowski, John Million, Ernie Dingo, Steve Rackman are making up the cast, as well as Charles S. Dutton is one of the new additions for this follow-up. Now, Paul Hogan he never had plans to be an actor. He didn't have plans to be a writer. He certainly didn't have plans to be a movie star. And his day-to-day had been working on building sites in Australia, working on bridges, so working at great heights as well. And it was through a series of coincidences that he's detailed in his recent memoir that he would slowly break into television. Once he got a foothold in there, and he was still working on bridges for quite a while, even though he was appearing on Australian television, he had the idea for a character that he felt could sustain a movie. So I've discussed before the original Crocodile Dundee film on a previous Film Stories episode, but one thing that's worth noting is, upon its release in 1986, a low-budget Australian comedy adventure had turned into absolute box office gold and had turned Paul Hogan into a global superstar. By the time the original Crocodile Dundee's business was done, it had grossed over $300 million worldwide in an era where $300 million worldwide was a lot of money. I'm not suggesting for a minute it's not at the moment, but in terms of relative success for movies, that was kind of an off-the-chart number. It got to the point where wherever he went in the world, people would come up to him and quote back the most famous line from the original film, where he says, "That's not a knife. I didn't treat you to an Australian accent done with a Brummie twang there. Consider yourself saved." At one point, Clint Eastwood ambled up to him and said, "So, how many times have you heard it?" And Hogan instantly knew he was talking about the line. He said, "Oh, a couple of thousand," to which Eastwood replied, "Welcome to the club." Eastwood would go on to say, "Did you write that line?" To which Hogan said, "Yes," and then Eastwood said, "Oh, well," and then deadpanned off. In the aftermath of the success, actually, of Crocodile Dundee as well, Paul Hogan was hired to be one of the hosts of the Oscars, and his introductory monologue is on YouTube. It's really terrific, and he did it off the cuff. And it was the first time he'd been to the Oscars. I think it's the last time he's been to the Oscars as well. But it's worth noting that even though this brought him huge amounts of success, and Crocodile Dundee, which was independently funded, also made him and his group of collaborators very rich, he didn't want to do another one. He wasn't interested in returning to the movies at all. Now, separately, Paramount Pictures was really, really keen to do another one. It wanted Crocodile Dundee II and was pushing Paul Hogan to do it. Now, Hogan hadn't really thought about it. In his view, and he's talked about this, he'd actually retired from filmmaking after the one film. Just one hit, that worked, move on, try something else. Went back to his television work. He was doing some work with the tourist board for Australia as well. He'd done that. He figured he couldn't top the first one, so why not quit while they were ahead? They certainly didn't need the money. But Paramount was persistent, and it started getting in touch with regularity with John Cornell. Now, John Cornell was Hogan's manager, and the pair of them went back a long way, trusted each other. The calls were coming into Cornell regularly, the refusals were going back. What changed the course of this story, though, was Paul Hogan's eldest son, Brett. Now, Brett Hogan as well was new to movies too, but he argued with his dad. Well, he just said, I've got an idea for where the next film should go. His dad wasn't convinced, but Brett reasoned, you can't leave the character of Mick Dundee in New York, which is where he'd been left at the end of the first film. He's got to go back to Australia. And Daddy Hogan thought about this and realised his son was right. That was the logical the logical step for that character, and he found a way in to this as a movie. So the first film had gathered together funds from a variety of investors, and in fact it was a Queensland investment bank that just helped underwrite the whole thing. This time Paramount Pictures wanted to stump up for the lot because Crocodile Dundee II, completely unlike the first film, was going to be a blockbuster movie. They knew this was going to be a blockbuster hit. There was audience appetite for more Mick Dundee adventures. The first film had been a huge hit on video, and so it was a big deal for the studio. It wasn't a big deal for Hogan. It's worth keep coming back to that, because what he was keen not to lose was what had kept the first film so special to him, that it was a bunch of mates effectively going off and making a film and learning how to make a film as they did it. After all, it had been made primarily by first-timers. Peter Feynman had never directed a movie before. Hogan had never written one. He'd never starred in one. But nonetheless, they thought, well, here's how we can do Crocodile Dundee 2. So John Cornell got in touch with Paramount to tell the studio the news. Let's assume the studio was on the happy side about this, but also the studio knew it had to be pretty hands-off here. The idea was that Brett and Paul Hogan would work on the script, Cornell would sort the movie deal out. They hit a stumbling block fairly early though, because Peter Feynman, who directed the first movie, well, he wasn't going to be available to do the second one, and so there was going to have to be someone new at the helm of this one. As it would turn out, this was not a tricky problem to solve, because Hogan, again wanting to capture that spirit of the first film, well, he looked around his collaborators, and there was John Cornell. Why doesn't John Cornell direct the movie? Never directed one before, but Hogan put the suggestion to him. Cornell was like, yeah, all right. No huge shortlist here, no stories in the Hollywood trades. Hogan asked his mate, would you direct the film? His mate said yes. So the script was coming together, the director was in place, but also the vast majority of the cast came back as well. Hogan obviously would be back as Mick Dundee. Now, Linda Kozlowski, who Hogan would ultimately marry after Crocodile Dundee II, she would return in the character of Sue. Johnny Melian, he would come in to play Wally for the very last time. He would die shortly after this particular movie. The new addition of note was actor Charles S. Dutton, and I'm going to come to him shortly. In terms of funding the movie, the story was that Paramount funded this by giving the partners, as in Hogan, Cornell and that team, an interest-free $20 million loan in return for Paramount getting the rights to the movie worldwide, with the exception of Australia. Now, Paramount, is worth noting, only got the US rights for the first Crocodile Dundee film. I think it was Fox who put it out here in the UK. But also, because of the way the first film had been put together, Hogan and Cornell owned the rights to the title, owned the rights to the characters, owned the rights to the sequels. They were in the negotiating position. So Paramount basically loaned them the money to make the movie and got the distribution in return for that. Now, I mentioned Hogan's memoir just before. It's called The Tap Dancing Knife Thrower. I think it's quite an interesting read. And it's got a couple of stories of the making of Crocodile Dundee II, which basically inverts the first film. The first film starts in Australia and goes to New York. This one starts in New York and goes back to Australia. It's also worth noting as well that whilst the first film was more of an adventure movie, an adventure comedy, this one had a bit more of an action side to it as well. So it was just changing things just a little bit for the second movie, even though the price of it was going to remain roughly the same. The shoot, it's worth noting, that was going to take place in Australia and also in New York in the summer of 1987, with Paramount eyeing a May 1988 release. And so there was an awful lot of location work involved in this one. So the New York part of the shoot, for instance, they shot in the Alphabet City area of the city, which Hogan describes in his memoir as, quote, a tough neighbourhood. And he recalled it wasn't a particularly welcoming one for a film crew as well. That in came the location film trucks and the noisy production, and it didn't massively endear itself to the locals, that streets were having to be closed and people weren't being allowed to go where usually they're allowed to go. And a small proportion of those people, well, again, let's just say, they weren't on the happy side of this. In particular, a very small proportion of these people decided they were going to do something about it, and they bustled their way past the security for the location set and decided that they were going to make their point known. So they stormed towards the makeup trailer. Now, unbeknownst to them at the point, inside that makeup trailer was actor Charles S. Dutton, and he was being prepared for filming. He was in costume. He had tissues around his collar and stuff, so the makeup didn't get on the costume. And as he walked out of the trailer, ready for his scenes, the locals confronted him and told him in no uncertain terms that this was their area. Now, I wasn't massively aware of the background of Charles S. Dutton, but he's someone who utterly turned his life around. That in his younger years, he spent several years in prison, was involved in some crimes that, let's just say, wouldn't make me pick on him in a hurry. But the locals didn't, these particular locals didn't know this. They thought they were picking on someone who was a little on the soft side. The punch that landed one of those locals over the front of a car, knocking them out cold, sort of forced them to address that particular opinion. Let's just say that there was slightly less problem from the local neighbours after that particular moment. There is one sequence that takes place in the American side of the movie where we see Mick Dundee walking around the edge of a New York skyscraper just as someone is preparing to jump. Now, this goes back to Hogan's days working as a rigger on bridges in Australia. And he talks in his memoir about this, about one of the bridges he worked on was basically a suicide hotspot, that he'd seen people jump to their death, and it haunted him, really. He wanted to address that a little bit in the film. And the sequence in the movie sees Mick Dundee just coming across someone who wants to end their life and just having a very in-character, almost comedic conversation with him. The visual joke being that Hogan is just walking round the edge of a building and he's many stories up, and it's just seen, well, that's the norm of what he does. As it turned out, that was pretty much the norm of what Hogan was doing when he was working back in Australia, that he would be working at great heights without an awful lot of support. And so it's worth noting when you watch sequences like that Crocodile Dundee II was not a film with CG in it. If you see things that are done at heights like that, well, there was a degree of height work involved in it. Apart from the early ructions, this was a fairly trouble-free production. It was still a case of a bunch of mates making a film. John Cornell settled into directing the movie fairly quickly. The shoot was on time. It was on budget. There was more action, again, as I just said, so it took a little bit longer to put together. But also they could still put it all together very much on their terms. That once the principal photography was over, for instance, Cornell was able to basically edit the film at his home. That he got a studio together in the Byron Bay area of New South Wales where he lived, and that's where he put together his cut of Crocodile Dundee. The movie was finished under budget. The movie was finished ahead of schedule as well. This was a very, very efficient piece of filmmaking. However, the difference again between the two films, though, was as it was heading towards release, it was very clear that Crocodile Dundee II was being positioned as one of the huge films of the summer. This didn't have the advantage of surprise. They sold this one hard, and they sold it heavily off the back of Paul Hogan. Paul Hogan was now a star. His turn at the Oscars had gone down an absolute treat. This was his second movie, and it was an eagerly awaited second movie as well. The cinema count straight away for its release. Well, this was going to get a wide release, over 2,000 cinemas in the US alone. But also, crucially, Paramount had the confidence to put this up against Sylvester Stallone, because Carol Coe at this point was pumping, $60 million into making Rambo 3. And Rambo, unusually, and it's still unusual even today, two huge blockbusters, two of the biggest films of the summer, were going to open on the same weekend. Crocodile Dundee was going to open against Rambo 3. And neither studio was going to blink. And in fact, from Paramount's point of view, it just felt it didn't need to blink. It just thought it probably had the edge on this one. By the time of Crocodile Dundee II came out as well, Hogan's international standing was such that he was doing an awful lot of publicity, and they didn't have to fight to get it either. There's a piece written by Tom O'Regan called Fair Dinkum Films, The Crocodile Dundee Phenomenon, and it describes how Hogan was put up for a 6-hour interview with Playboy, that he did interviews with Barbara Walters over 2 days for her TV show. He was on the cover of several national magazines in the US. Then this was before the release of the movie. This was all building up. This wasn't the retrospective stuff, as was the case with the original film. This was now an expected hit. And as the New York Times would report, because Crocodile Dundee II and Rambo 2 in May of 1988 was kicking off blockbuster season, and the New York Times reported this under the headline, Hollywood's summer attack troops are storming the box office this weekend. And such was the size of these two films, and in particular Crocodile Dundee II, that George Lucas was minded to delay the release of a film he was working on by the name of Willow. You might have heard of Willow. But its release date was moved to get it out the way of Crocodile Dundee II. The film then arrived in cinemas, and critics, it'd be fair to say that the critics weren't as keen this time. The element of surprise had gone. There was a feeling that it just kind of told the same jokes. And in fact, the New York Times rather unkindly suggested that the fact that the film had a plot this time was one of its downsides. Certainly it's a denser movie. There's a lot more story in this particular one. But nonetheless, within 4 days of its release, the film had got its budget back. It was pulling in over $1 million a day. It was, there's an article that in the Los Angeles Times that talks about Paramount's marketing chief, Barry London, surveyed the revenue sheets spread across his desk. It's mind-boggling, he said. That there was a theory at this point that sequels did, about 65% of the business of the original movie. And whilst Crocodile Dundee 2 wouldn't do the business of the original movie, its opening weekend was phenomenal, not least because it was opening at the same time as Rambo 3. That Crocodile Dundee 2 opened over for the Memorial Day weekend in the US to $24.5 million. Rambo 3 opened to $16.7 million. Both were considered huge hits, but Crocodile Dundee 2 in particular was, the headlines wrote themselves. Crocodile Dundee runs rings around Rambo, etc., etc. And that was the story, that Mick Dundee had defeated Sylvester Stallone's Rambo, that this film that had cost, less than $20 million to make, had become one of the biggest movies of the summer. lightning certainly struck twice. That the film would go on to take $109 million in the US, another $130 million overseas, for a worldwide gross of $240 million. Now, again, that's down on the first movie. There's no doubt about that. But nonetheless, that's still a huge amount of change. The first movie made $328 million worldwide, but it wasn't commonplace for films to cross $100 million at the US box office in 1988, and that's just what Crocodile Dundee II did. In fact, if you look at the annual chart for 1988 in the US, well, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was the top grossing movie. Crocodile Dundee was in 5th place, one of only 5 films to cross $100 million. Big was in 4th place, which would open the week after as well. You have to go down to 13th place to find Rambo. Willow sits there in 12th, actually, so that wasn't a bad decision to delay the release. In the aftermath, there was inevitably is there going to be a Crocodile Dundee 3? But this time Paul Hogan was adamant. He didn't want to do it again. He was, and it's not that he wouldn't do another film, because he did a smattering of them. But film was more seen as a treat for him rather than this is how he was going to make his living. He would go on to do Almost an Angel, which featured Charlton Heston, which wasn't received anywhere near as well. It turned up in Flipper in the 1990s as well. It did one or two indie films, and in fact by the time Crocodile Dundee was revived in the early 2000s, well, he kind of regarded that as a mistake, that looking back on the movie he just feels he shouldn't have done that, and it's the one time really he was pressured into doing something, into doing a film. And even though there's been a more modern day sort of revival in the spirit of films like JCVD and things like that, with the 2020 release, the very excellent Mr. Dundee, where Paul Hogan plays a man thrust back into the spotlight of his most famous role. Well, in spite of that, there's not been a threatened revival really for Crocodile Dundee, a proper Crocodile Dundee 4 or a Crocodile Dundee TV series. Nonetheless, the legacy of it thoroughly lives on. I dug out an article that Variety published in 1997, which was a chart of the best performing video cassette releases in the US of all time. What do you know? Both Crocodile Dundees are in there. I pulled up a chart of the most successful Australian films ever at the box office. What do you know? Both Crocodile Dundee movies are in there. They're both, appreciating they're both of their time. It was one of those cases where lightning sort of got caught in the bottle twice, really. And whilst, John Cornell didn't go on to direct Juggernauts or anything, Paul Hogan didn't go on to do huge movies. What they got was very particular to them, very particular of the time, but also huge, independent, successful films. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Again, thank you so much to the people at Mutiny Shaving, mutinyshaving.co.uk, for their support of it. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Website, got one of them, filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with movie news, movie features, movie reviews. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, you can find back issues of Film Stories and Film Stories Junior magazines. If you go to YouTube, youtube.com/film stories, there's video film stories there, as you could probably guess. Facebook on that too, facebook.com/film stories online. Most important thing though, this has been recorded in early 2021. And it would be fair to say the planet's having some tough times at the moment. Please stay safe and look after yourselves. I can't thank you enough for all your support. I'll be back soon with some more film stories, but until then, you will take care. Bye bye.